Happening, folks. In keeping with my heartfelt commitment to keep you entertained and in honor of today's movie, I thought I would present this review from outside my cabin.
Why don't you just tell them you burnt down half of the kitchen?
That is totally unrelated. The Damned 2024 is an existential folk horror film written and directed by Icelandic director Thordur Palsson. It stars Joe Cole, Rory McCann, and Odessa Young, who I wasn't all that familiar with prior to watching today's movie. Like a lot of movies we've looked at recently, The Damned did really well with critics and not as well with normal folks like you and I. So we're gonna break the movie down into 3 acts, and we can decide together whether or not we think this Icelandic existential horror flick deserves such an icy reception.
This story follows a young 19th century widow named Eva as she's managing her remote winter fishing post in an unspecified Arctic bay. Eva inherited the outpost when her husband Magnus died in a shipwreck against a jagged outcrop of rocks within eyeshot of the outpost she currently runs. Unfortunately, her outfit is not doing well. The supplies are dwindling, the fish have become scarce, and the closest village is on the other side of a giant snow-capped mountain. Recently, things have gotten so bad, Eva and her crew have been forced to start eating the fishing bait. And right when things seem like they couldn't get any worse, another shipwreck's in the teeth, where Eva's husband perished right in front of them. They're devastated at seeing the disaster occurring in real time, but Eva makes the tough decision not to row out to them as they've barely enough supplies to sustain themselves. The next day, a full barrel of salted pork washes up onto the shore, and from the look on Ragnar's face, it's frickin' lovely. Ragnar also tells us it's a miracle the pork made it to their shores at all given the tide patterns. So, Eva's survival instinct prompts her to gather the crew up that night to see if they can find any other floating food back at the crash site. They find some lamp oil and a few bottles of brandy, but they also encounter a handful of freezing, terrified survivors clinging to the rocky incisors. The desperate survivors throw themselves into the icy waters hoping for a lift to safety, only to be rejected and even beaten away from the boat. As terrible as they feel having to do it, any additional men would have capsized the tiny vessel, so they bring the first act to a close, plunging a blade into the face of the last helpless sailor.
A strong first act in any horror movie has to establish the story world, it has to build up some tension and some dread, and normally it's brought to a close with an inciting incident. And that inciting incident needs to be enticing enough to make us want to find out what's happening in the next act. And for me, this first act of The Damned ticked all of those boxes.
The story world hits all the right horror notes, immersing us in the bleak, monochrome tones of 19th century Iceland. The wide-open scene composition and harsh lighting of the country's desolate, barren backdrop enhances the isolation perfectly. Although it's a bit early to judge any of the performances, by the end of Act 1 we've seen what Eva and her crew witnessed, and we understand why she made the choice not to intervene.
Heading into the second act, we can feel the dread creeping in for all of them as they ponder the potential consequences of that very difficult decision.
The following morning, bodies start washing ashore, and the mood turns very dark.
If you remember, I mentioned Ragnar suggested the tides should have stopped that pork from arriving on their shores at all. Now, normally, that kind of an observation would have floated past most viewers without being picked up on. But when you consider multiple bodies are now landing in the exact same spot, their arrival takes on a bit of a sinister tone, as if maybe something's guiding them there.
One of the crew finds a gold watch on one of the dead sailors, and Eva insists he puts it back out of respect. Being the 19th century, many members of the crew are preoccupied with Nordic folklore. They're worried Eva's decision and the subsequent events may have turned the sailors' bodies into draugr, or undead, reanimated mythological creatures similar to vampires. And they're so worried about it, they tie the bodies up in twine, nail their feet down, and nail the coffins closed. All precautions to ensure the hateful bodies don't rise up and break out of the coffins to exact revenge. But it's not long before Eva starts having vivid nightmares and visions of a dark figure lurking in the snowy shadows. On realizing what's happening, Helga, one of the older crew members, advises Eva the only way to remove a Draugur's curse is to burn it. Unexpectedly, the crew pulls in a big haul of fish the next day, but before they've had a chance to get excited about it, the fish disappear, along with Helga. They follow Helga's trail to where where they buried the sailors and one of the coffins are empty. That sets off the paranoia and collective delusional thinking, which inevitably leads to the violence and accusations between the remaining crew members. And all of this brings the second act to a close.
The second act in a great horror movie has to significantly elevate the tension and whatever danger is threatening the characters. And ideally, our protagonist will become more isolated and directly threatened by the antagonist, or antagonistic forces, whatever form they happen to take.
In The Damned, the tension definitely ramps up as Eva's crew starts vanishing, one by one, with no clear explanation. Trust breaks down, and Eva's forced to face off against whatever is targeting them. As the protagonist, Eva definitely rises to the occasion, which is no small feat given the era and the circumstances. And Odessa Young does a commendable job bringing Eva's complexity to life. If I have an issue with Act 2, it lies with the rest of the cast. While the actors seem committed to their roles, the writing doesn't give them much to work with. I have to admit, after 2 viewings, I still can't remember any of their names or character traits. That makes them feel less like characters and more like Droggear fodder.
Droggear fodder, you know, like vampire food. There's a little joke for all my Viking horror fans out there. You know who you are. I fucking don't.
With everything falling apart all around her, Eva takes the lead and sets out to find whatever's causing the death and the chaos. And whatever it is, she's determined to bring it to an end. Eva's hunting leads her to even more death, as another crew member is lost to the foggy burial sites. She also finds Helga shortly after, alone and frozen to death. Then back at the cabin, Eva's most reliable and trusted crew member, Daniel, is taken over by something unseen, and he kills another crew member before ending himself in front of Eva. Then Eva's dragged into the final confrontation with the Droggear, who attempts to corner her, but she manages to shoot the creature and escape the cabin, leaving it behind, finally vanquished in the fire. The story's brought to a close with a flashback, showing us the Droggear was nothing more than a starving, terrified survivor from the shipwreck. Eva couldn't understand his language and wasn't able to realize he was offering her his gold pocket watch in exchange for shelter and some of the food he took from them. On closer inspection, the pocket watch is the same one found on one of the bodies earlier, and the movie ends with a little bit of head scratching.
Before I dive into my conclusion, I'm going to make a quick disclaimer. I've worked as an extra on a lot of movie and TV productions, like Game of Thrones, including the multi-Emmy award-winning Battle of the Bastards episode. During the filming of that single battle, I spent 10 grueling days waking up at 3 a.m., getting hair and makeup done by 6 a.m., and battling through real mud, real snow, and yes, real horse shit until at least 10 p.m. that night. And we worked under the constant supervision of a Royal British Marine who screamed at us like we were real soldiers in a real battle. And I'm telling you this because sometimes I can't help but see beyond the frame of the camera with movies like The Damned. I know exactly what it feels like to have to work a long, hard, cold day in an icy environment, the way the cast and crew of this movie would have. And knowing they only had $1.8 million to work with, it does factor into my criticism. This isn't Hollywood we're talking about. This is a group of people trying to tell a spooky story.
With all that in mind, The Damned gets a lot right. The atmosphere lingers through the entire runtime, maintaining a balance between psychological and supernatural terror. It doesn't overexpose its threat like some horror films. And Odessa Young's portrayal of Eva is a masterclass, blending strength with vulnerability and complexity, seemingly effortlessly. However, the ensemble cast lacks standout characters to complement Eva. The second act's lack of plot events slows the pacing, and Act 3, while very atmospheric, feels like it rushes by too quickly. But my main issue with this movie is the ending. I love ambiguity and subtlety in a horror movie, but this ending feels abrupt and a little bit confusing, like a smack in the face that leaves you wondering what the hell just happened. It left me wondering if maybe I'd missed some subtle, relevant detail somewhere along the way. And that means I'll certainly end up watching this movie again. So, should you watch The Damned if you haven't seen it already? Or should you tie the DVD up tight with some twine and nail its feet to the Amazon box it arrived in?
I would recommend checking this one out actually, and not just for the behind the scenes stuff I talked about earlier. This sort of movie will work for a lot of people. The term slow burn horror is getting thrown around a lot lately. And I think it often reflects a person's attention span more than the actual pacing. And so, if you don't struggle with your attention span, you might find The Damned moves at its own deliberate pace rather than feeling slow. If you've seen the movie already, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you've got nothing to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes, there's another video right here. And until next time, folks,